Hi, good evening. I'm Shalamis Hess, coordinator of the YU Library Book Talks. Tonight we will hear from author Dr. Moshe Sokolow about his book, Pursuing Peshat, Tanakh, Parshanut, and Talmud Torah. Dr. Sokolow will be interviewed by Professor Smadar Rosensweig, a noted scholar in her own right, professor of Bible at Stern College. Thank you all for logging on. And if anyone has any questions at any time during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the chat and it will hopefully be addressed at the end. I now hand it over to Professor Rosensweig.
Hello, everybody. It's really such a pleasure to be here tonight, both as a professor of Stern College who teaches Tanakh, Parshanut, and about Nechama Leibovitz, and also because Dr. Sokolow and I are on the Kodesh Press 929 Tanakh Project together, and that's where this book is from, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But Dr. Sokolow is really a renowned professor. He's the Fanya Gottesfeld-Heller Professor of Jewish Education and the Associate Dean at Azrieli Graduate School of Jewish Education. Along with Azrieli, he has taught Tanakh at Yeshiva College, Stern College for Women, EMC, IBC, and Bernard Revel Graduate School, all connected with YU, as well as at Ben-Gurion University and Bar Ilan. Dr. Sokolow has been teaching a class on the Parsha at Lincoln Square Synagogue that is now in its 40th year, and he's been a very active member of Hatzalah for close to 40 years. I also want to mention some of Dr. Sokolow's earlier publications. His prior publications include studies in the weekly Parsha based on the lessons of Nechama Leibovitz, Tanakh, an owner's manual, also Reading the Rav, exploring religious themes in the thought of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, In the Company of Prophets, reflections on Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and Timely Words, holiday insights throughout the year, and many articles and other publications. Today, we are going to be speaking about his new book, Redifat HaPshat, Pursuing Peshat, Tanakh and Parshanut, and Talmud Torah. And I want to thank Dr. Sokolow for a beautiful inscription that also connects him, myself, and my husband, Rav Rosenzweig, to our fathers, because he was connected with my father, Rabbi David Eliach Zatzal, and with Rabbi Bernard Rosenzweig, my father-in-law, Zatzal. So first, we want to start with some personal background and questions. So my first question for you is, how did you first find your passion in teaching Tanakh and teaching the present and future teachers?
Thank you, Smadar, for that introduction, and thank all of you for joining us this evening. I guess my interest in Tanakh was the product of two things, one internal, one external. I must have had some personal inclination towards it. Otherwise, the spark might never have been lit in the first place. But I suppose that it was fanned into a flame, so to speak, by some of my teachers, particularly high school teachers, as I now, reflect back on that experience that goes back well over 60 years. One of my first experiences as a Tanakh person was as a high school sophomore and junior, when I represented my high school in one of the very early Chidon Tanakh contests. In fact, because the first year that I participated in it, I was only a sophomore, the school was allowed 3 representatives. So the first representative in the advanced Hebrew category was a senior. The representative to the intermediate Hebrew category was a junior. And since I was a sophomore, I was sent to the English category. So I must say that to this very day, words like Hezekiah, Josiah, Jeremiah, Isaiah just simply roll off my tongue based on that experience. But to tell you something a little embarrassing, that's probably why I didn't win that year. I got knocked out in the final round when I didn't know the answer to the question, who fell off a chair and broke his neck? What I did is I translated the question into Hebrew for myself, and I was racking my brain to come up with somebody who broke his tzavar. And I couldn't come up with anything. I said, I don't know. And they said, well, it was Eli. For those of you who haven't caught on to it yet, of course, Eli is Eli. They said it was Eli. And I protested. I said, no, I said, it doesn't say that Eli broke his neck. It says that he fell off a chair and it's vayishbor et mifrakto, which probably means that he broke his spine. But they said that I was wrong, and that was the end of it. That's the last time I enrolled in the contest in the English category. The next year I was already eligible for the Hebrew category. I did much better. And on the basis of that, I earned a place in one of the early world Bible contests for youth, the Chidon HaTanakh Olami Lenoar, which took place in Israel, in Jerusalem, in May of 1965. And I think I even have a picture here to share with you. You probably won't find me in the back. It's not a particularly clear picture, but I'm sure you can recognize the person who's at the microphone. He was the head of the judging panel, and his name, of course, was David Ben Gurion. He was the chief judge. And the moderator who was asking the questions was Abba Evan, better known as Abba Iban, who was enjoying the opportunity to translate the questions into a variety of different languages for the different participants. And here too, I made it all the way to the final round, and I got knocked out because I couldn't cite the full pasuk in which 3 words appeared. They told me, where does it say, Ad Ya'avor Za'am? Now, the truth is that after the Scud missile crisis in Israel years ago, the pasuk became very popular because people would go into their safe rooms very briefly, and then they would come out again with the all clear signal, and everybody started quoting this pasuk all over the place. The full pasuk, it's in Yeshayahu, is Lech Ami Bo B'chadarecha, Usigor delatecha acharecha, right? Go into your safe rooms, so to speak. Chabi kim'at rega, and take cover there briefly. Ad ya'avor za'am, until the trouble is over. I couldn't remember that pasuk, so I thought for a moment and I made one up. And I said, Ad ya'avor za'am Hashem v'shav mecharon apo v'nicham al hara'a asher bikesh la'asot la'amo. And Ben Gurion and the other judges went running for their concordancias, and they spoke to each other, and they said, "Ein pasuk kazeh." And I smiled and I said, "Yeah, I know, but you can't blame a kid for trying." So anyway, that's pretty much my early experiences with Tanakh. I tried to major in Tanakh in Yeshiva College, but it wasn't possible. The best I could do was be a Jewish studies major. But in the Bernard Revel Graduate School, I was able to do a minor in Bible. It was not possible to do a major in Bible. But I was able for my doctoral dissertation to focus on a Perush on Tanakh. It happened to be a 10th century Perush, very early one, that was written originally in Judeo-Arabic. So part of what I did was translate it into Hebrew and then write a commentary on it. And if you don't recognize the name of the Parshan, don't worry about it. His name was Yefet ben Eli, and he was a Karaite. He's actually one of the 2 Karaites whom Ibn Ezra frequently quotes favorably. And that's part of what his appeal was to me. But with that doctorate in hand, I started teaching Bible in the Bernard Revel Graduate School, as well as in some of the undergraduate schools of Yeshiva University. But at some point in time, I kind of changed direction. after teaching for a while, I began to reflect on the fact that the incoming students that I was teaching didn't seem to know as much as the students had known when I started teaching. So I decided that I had to determine what was happening. So I started talking to high school teachers. And the high school teacher said, before we answer your question, we have a question for you. The question is, why do you think that the students entering high school now know less about Tanakh than they used to know? So I kind of figured that what I'd have to do next is talk to the elementary school teachers, and then they would kick the can down the road to the early childhood teachers, and then eventually it would turn out to be something having to do with their mother's diet when they were, in utero. And so I decided that far back I wasn't going to go, but I thought that at least that I would learn a little more about the education process so that I could at least maybe, help to cure the situation. Basically, that took me to Israel for several years in a postdoctoral program, and that was when I met Nechama Leibovitz. Now, I had met Nechama Leibovitz previously when my so-called gap year was spent in the Kerem B'Yavne Theological Seminary. And during the month of Nisan, when the yeshiva was closed, the Jewish agency took us all into Yerushalayim and put us up in a hotel, fed us in Machon Gold, which at that time was known as the BMT. Not Beit Midrash LeTorah, but the best meal in town. And in return for our being fed, we had to attend classes there, and one of the classes was given by Nechama Leibovitz. And at that time, I had some questions about her approach, but it didn't really interest me enough to approach her. When I was back in Israel 20 years later, I had a different perspective on it. I was now interested as much in the teaching of Tanakh as I had been previously in the study of Tanakh. So I found that she was giving a series of classes to Israeli Tanakh teachers. So I found my way to the place where she was teaching Israeli Tanakh teachers, and it didn't take 5 minutes, and she was saying some of the same things that I disagreed with 20 years before, and I was still disagreeing with them. What had changed though is that this time I went over to her after the class, and I said, I've been having this problem with you for 20 years. And she said to me, okay, do you have a car? I said, yes, I do. She said, fine, you'll drive me home and we'll talk about it. And that started a relationship that lasted for quite a while, in which I would drive her to and from her public lectures. And in the car going and in the car coming back, we would have opportunities to talk about where we agreed and where we disagreed. And yeah, that's pretty much brings us up to the present, where I'm in the Azrieli Graduate School for Jewish Education. I teach more general classes like the philosophy of Jewish education, the history of Jewish education, curriculum development, but occasionally I get to teach a course on didactics, methods of teaching Tanakh, how to incorporate Parshanut into the teaching of Tanakh and things like that. And I'm sure that we're ready now for some more particular questions. Smadar, back to you.
Okay, so I just want to encourage everyone, if they have a chance, to buy this book. So you see the cover, and the title is Redifat HaPshat, Pursuing Peshat, Tanakh, Parshanut, and Talmud Torah, or Talmud Torah. So number one, I really want to know why you called it Redifat HaPshat, Pursuing Peshat, and also what are the different types of Parshanut, and how does knowledge of the Parshanim and their styles help us understand Torah and the Parshanim better? Meaning, what is this synergy between the two?
Okay. So the title of the book comes from a phrase that is used by Ramban in one of his Torah commentaries. The subject of the commentary is somewhat abstruse. It shows up in Bereshit Perek Lamed Vav, which, to those of you who might know, it's the chapter that talks about the genealogies of Edom, the Edomite king list, so to speak. But apropos of that, he argues against some of the interpretations of his predecessors. And among those predecessors are Rashbam and Ibn Ezra. And referring to the commentaries of Rashbam and Ibn Ezra, Ramban refers to them as Rodefei HaPeshat, the pursuers of Peshat. So basically, that's what gave me the idea that I should call the book Pursuing Peshat, since Peshat in many cases is a will-o'-the-wisp. In order to determine what the pshat is of a verse, we have to a certain extent, be able to put ourselves into the author's shoes. If in fact the foundation of Peshat is what was the verse intended by its original author to be understood by its first audience, then as I said, we have to a large extent, be able to recreate that context for ourselves. Now, let me just digress for a moment just to say something I think rather important about the nature of interpretation in general. For the need to arise to interpret past literature for a contemporary age, it's necessary to have a measure of what's called a spiritual distance between the world that is being interpreted and the world that awaits that interpretation. A spiritual distance is the result of where the present is a continuation of the past rather than a break from the past, but it's a continuation of the past where, on account of certain developments that have arisen since the past, the present is somewhat detached from that past. Detached enough that to make sense of the past, it needs to be interpreted. That's why, of course, Parshanut HaMikra is something at which those who have excelled at it at all times are those who maintain the strongest spiritual connection with it. The Tanaim, the Amoraim, the Rishonim, the Acharonim, and even the contemporary period. Yes, because the Bible, or at least what non-Jews refer to as the Old Testament, became part of the Christian scriptures, Christians also have an interest, an active interest in understanding the Bible, right? Even understanding the Jewish Bible as opposed to their own Bible. And there are indeed any number of people in the world today who are acknowledged, even from a Jewish perspective, as being excellent Bible scholars. But their biblical scholarship probably usually consists only of recreating the context, the original context. That is to say, using tools like archaeology, using tools like ancient Semitic languages and literatures. They are particularly good at helping us to determine what I called just a couple of minutes ago, what the original author intended to be understood by his first audience. But they don't go beyond that, whereas traditional Jewish biblical commentators do, because they not only want to understand what the text might have originally meant, they also operate on the basis of an axiom that the rabbis called Nevu'ah shehutzrecha lidorot nichtava, that there were many, many more prophets and many more prophecies than those that are recorded in the 24 canonical books of Tanakh. Therefore, the Chazal asked themselves a rhetorical question. What criterion was utilized in order to determine which of those many prophecies would be preserved, as opposed to others which were equally prophetic, but weren't preserved in Tanakh? And their answer was that those...
Relevance plays a central role in Parshanut?
Well, it's yes, meaning their determination was that those prophecies that were preserved precisely because they were what they call hutzrecha l'dorot, that they were necessary for future generations. That means that you can't stop by saying, well, when Yeshayahu said this is what the words meant, and that's how the people understood it. You have to go beyond that, and you have to say, okay. But the reason that it's part of what we call Kitvei Kodesh, Holy Scripture, is because it has to mean something to me. I wasn't a contemporary of Yeshayahu, and yet still I have to be able to understand what he meant, because his lessons were intended not only for his contemporaries, but they were intended for me as well. Therefore, the basic difference between traditional Jewish Bible interpretation and either Jewish interpretation that isn't traditional or non-Jewish interpretation is whether you stop simply at the determination of what this might have meant at the time that it was first spoken to its immediate audience, or whether you persevere in trying to go beyond that into just what does it mean to me as somebody who maintains this spiritual relationship with the text. What does it continue to mean to me today?
Okay, fascinating. So you have the idea of original intent, but also I know in the book you speak a lot about original interpretation, that without the interpretation of Chazal and with the Parshanim, right, that's what keeps, Torah alive and the Masorah from generation to generation, that the Torah really speaks to us both at Pshat and Derash. So how does that interplay of Pshat and Derash work in Parshanut?
So first of all, interplay is an interesting way to put it, because if we take a look, for example, at three paradigmatic Parshanim, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, or other than Ibn Ezra, it might be Rashbam, right? But I'll stick to Ibn Ezra, and Ramban. Now, of the three, okay, Rashi maintains, in fact, the cover of the book actually is a page of what is considered to be one of the oldest surviving manuscripts of Rashi's commentary on the Torah, thank you, and underlined, not by me, but by somebody who once was in possession of the manuscript, happens to be the passage that's incorporated into Rashi's commentary on Breshit chapter 3, verse 8, where he declares that his purpose in writing a Torah commentary was Va'ani lo vati ela lipshuto shel mikra. Right? Rashi says that his intention in writing a commentary was to establish the pshat, but then he goes on and says, U la'agada hamiyashevet divrei mikra. But he will also incorporate midrash, right? Midrashei agada, providing that the Midrashei Agadah contribute to the resolution of textual difficulties. So in Rashi, you do have an interplay of Pshat and Derash, okay? You have the same interplay, same kind of interplay in the commentary of Ramban. Because what Ramban does on frequent occasion is he will begin by citing Rashi's interpretation of a verse. He will then move to cite Ibn Ezra's interpretation of a verse, and then he will make some determination of his own as to whether Rashi was right, or Ibn Ezra was right, or on occasion he'll actually say, I don't agree with either of them, and he'll give his own interpretation. So in Rashi there is an interplay of Pshat and Derash. In Ramban, what we have basically is a contrast between Pshat and Derash. In Ibn Ezra, he basically doesn't cite Derash at all. In his introduction to his Torah commentary, he talks about several different approaches to Parshanut. And one of them he attributes to the Jewish scholars of the Christian world, Ibn Ezra himself having lived in Muslim Spain and in Muslim North Africa. So when he talks about the Jewish scholars of Artzot Edom, of the Christian world, he's talking primarily about Rashi and other French Parshanim. And Ibn Ezra says that their approach to understanding Torah is the approach of Pshat. And he says that whereas if he compares the understanding of Tanakh to a target, to a bullseye, where, if you wish, the center of the target, the bullseye itself, is the Pshat, okay? So he says that some alternative approaches to the Torah, they hit the target, but they haven't hit the bullseye. When it comes to the Midrashic approach to Torah, Ibn Ezra says, they don't even know where the target is. So, as I said, if we go through the history of Parshanut, as I do, I chose a dozen Parshanim in the chapter on Peshat and Derash. I chose a dozen Parshanim, ranging from one of, if not the earliest Parshan, Saadia Gaon in the 10th century, and going through Malbim, one of the latest Parshanim in the 19th century. And in each case, I give some paradigmatic instances, some illustrations of where they express their opinions, not about an individual Agadah, an individual Derash, as much as where they express their methodological points of view on how one should approach the relationship between Pshat and Derash. Like Rashi, some of them will have an interplay. Like Ibn Ezra, some of them will will hew the line of Pshat in total disregard of Derash. And in yet others, like Rambam, they'll play one off against the other.
Right. Or sometimes, right, integrate, meaning Ramban really sometimes does integrate the different, Pshat, Remez, Derash, and Sod. And, Rashi with the Perush Kaful, really integrating, Pshat and Derash. And Ibn Ezra, when it comes to halakha, is very reliant on many of the drashot, even though in more of the narrative pieces, unless it's a strong, Kabbalah. So we do see the different schools. And what are some of the ideas that you feel that you have many ideas and methodologies, and especially shurim, or how to teach, certain psukim or bigger themes in this book. So you not only, do foundational and educational pieces, you also do some instructional pieces. What ideas do you want to share with our crowd, about some of your ideas that you think, are important for people to know when they're studying Tanakh and Parshanut?
So in fact, there's a chapter in the book that's called The Pedagogy of Parshanut, where I actually lay out 5 what I think are progressively ascending levels of dealing with the text, from the lowest level, which is simply having the ability to read the words correctly. And reading the words correctly doesn't only mean matching the consonants and the vowels, it also means putting the accent on the proper syllable, and goes beyond that to being able to correctly punctuate the verse. Now, strangely enough, I continue to meet even adults who, if I tell them that Torah texts are punctuated, give me a funny look. And they say, what do you mean they're punctuated? And that's because I think that one of the failings, I won't call it a failure, but one of the failings of the way in which Tanakh is taught in day schools today is that we don't inform the students that what they might have heard called ta'amei hamikra, and which they tend to think of primarily and sometimes even exclusively as being musical notations, are really essentially punctuation marks. Now, everybody can tell a sof pasuk because in every printed Tanakh, in addition to the sof pasuk, which is the vertical line that goes beneath the accented syllable of the last word, the printer kindly put in a dot or 2 dots or something like that, or in parentheses, they'll put the number of the following pasuk. So everybody can know where a pasuk ends, okay? But to know where there's the greatest pause within a pasuk, what the Ta'amim call an etnachta, from the word meaning relax, and to know within the 2 halves of the pasuk, separated by the etnachta and the sof pasuk, that there is a hierarchy of the remaining punctuation marks, of the remaining ta'amim, which if you can master them, right, then you can read any pasuk. Well, in 21 of the 24 books of Tanakh, you can read any pasuk correctly. The 3 exceptions are what are called the Sifrei Amet, Iyov, Mishlei, and Tehillim, that for reasons that really nobody has been able to determine with complete certainty, seem to have different styles of punctuation. In the case of Tehillim, probably because it's poetic. In the case of Iyov, because it's philosophical, and Mishlei maybe just because it was schlepped along by Tehillim and Iyov, which in your standard Tanakh appear on either side of it. So maybe just somebody took all 3 of them together and said they are going to be treated differently. I think that if students were made more aware of that, then not only would they have an easier job and do a better job of reading Tanakh and understanding it and interpreting it on their own, which is out of my 5 stages of approaching Tanakh of pedagogy is the highest stage, right? To be able to come up with an original interpretation of your own, which is true to the original meanings of the words, as well as being true to the way that it was understood traditionally since the time that it was originally written. But I think that if we can get students to the point where they can feel confident in offering their own individual original understandings of biblical verses, then we've accomplished an additional educational purpose, and that is that they will come to love Tanakh, ahavat Torah. In fact, I give myself a little bit of a shout out. I'm working now on another book whose working title is Combining Ahavat Torah and Yirat Shamayim. I'm using Yirat Shamayim kind of like a code word for spirituality. And my argument is that one of the ways in which to enhance day school students' spirituality, if we define spirituality minimally as feeling that I have a personal relationship with God, right, then one of the few tangible ways that we have to connect with God is through the Word of God. And I think that bringing students to the point where they feel confident and competent in having their own understanding of Tanakh, providing, again, as I said, that it's consistent with previous understandings, right? Then I think that that's a surefire way of getting them to enhance the feeling that they have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that covers that. Now, I want to just maybe take a minute and give a couple of quick examples. So I'm just going to share my screen with you to show you a couple of quick examples that I think are paradigms of the tension amongst Parshanim between Peshat and Derash, and what I think are the educational, or maybe let's even call them spiritual, consequences of that tension. So let me start with this one. You know what? I'm going to pick one from the Kriyat HaTorah of last Shabbat and one from the Kriyat HaTorah of this coming Shabbat. So we'll kind of like envelop ourselves in the Parashiot HaShavua. So here is a pasuk from Parashat Mishpatim. The pasuk, as you see, is lo tihya acharei rabim l'ra'ot. Do not follow the majority if they're wrong or if they're headed in the wrong direction. Okay. And now comes the second half of the pasuk, which is somewhat more complicated. By the way, if you see right underneath it, this is the way the sentence would be diagrammed, following the punctuation marks that are represented by the Tamei HaMikra. So you notice that the verse is split in half at the word l'ra'ot, and then each half of the pasuk is further subdivided, depending upon how many words and how many different punctuation marks there are. The second half of the pasuk is the complicated one. It says, lo ta'aneh al riv. La'anot and riv, the combination means to offer testimony. You may recall in the Kriyat HaTorah of 2 weeks ago, right? In the Aseret HaDibrot, okay? It says, lo ta'aneh v're'acha eid shaker. So la'anot be has something to do with means, it's an idiomatic expression that is specific to some sort of a judicial setting. So riv is an argument. So lo ta'aneh al riv means don't get involved. I'm being somewhat general now. Don't get involved in a court case. Under what circumstances? Lintot acharei rabim lahatot. In a court case, don't follow the majority lahatot. So the question is, what does the word lahatot mean, and what relationship does it bear to the balance of that half of the pasuk? Now, if we took only the last 3 words in the pasuk, acharei rabim lahatot, you might recognize it as 3 words that are cited frequently in the Talmud and elsewhere in support of the principle of majority rule. In the Talmud, when it says that you have to follow the majority, what follows immediately is, where does it say I have to follow the majority? And the answer is 3 words in this pasuk, acharei rabim lahatot. But if you take a look at the diagram of the sentence, you see that the words acharei rabim lahatot don't go together. Lahatot is separate from acharei rabim, and acharei rabim is attached to the previous clause, which is lo ta'aneh al riv lintot acharei rabim, which means that the way that the halacha interpreted the end of this pasuk is inconsistent with the meaning that is given to it by its syntax. Now, how do I dare say that? It's easy. Rashi said it first. Because you see Rashi's commentary on the pasuk, and he starts off by saying, Yesh b'mikra hazeh, this pasuk, midrashei chachmei Yisrael, has been commented on by the sages of Israel. He's referring to halakhic midrashim, to the Mechilta on Shemot in particular. He says, Aval, however, ein lashon hamikra miyushav bahen al ofnab. He says, it's unfortunate, he says, but the way in which Chazal interpreted this pasuk in the Midrash and in the Talmud is not what the words mean. And then he continues, and in the final paragraph, he says, Va'ani omer li yashvo al ofnav kipshuto. I can give you an interpretation of this pasuk, which is truer to the meaning that is assigned to it by the punctuation, by its syntax. So here we have an example of where Rashi tells us that Peshat, right, can even defer or outweigh an halakhic interpretation. Now, of course, Rashi agreed with the halacha. He accepted the halacha. In fact, even Ibn Ezra, it's one of the psukim, Smadar, that you were referring to, Ibn Ezra in his commentary on this pasuk points out that the word lahatot, when it's used in the Torah, always means to incline towards something bad. Right? Lo tatem mishpat ger. Lahatot, in a context of riv or mishpat or din, always means to pervert justice. Therefore, Ibn Ezra, like Rashi, points out that acharei rabim lahatot is not at all what the verse is saying. But Ibn Ezra, having said that, having made the same point as Rashi, that the pshat of the pasuk is not what Chazal are saying, nevertheless concludes his own commentary on it by saying, Uma she'etiku hu ha'emet, that the traditional interpretation assigned to this pasuk by the Midrash and by Chazal, he says that's the truth. It isn't pshat, but it's the truth. Now here we have to be very careful, and we have to distinguish between two sets of terms. There's true and false, and there's pshat and drash. When you say that something is the pshat, that doesn't necessarily make it true. When you say something is drash, that doesn't, conversely, make it wrong. Okay? Pshat and drash are not categories, are not the same as true and false. They are more in the sense of good or bad, meaning that they're more subjective than objective. Therefore, Rashi, he can say, what Chazal have to say, or Ibn Ezra too, what Chazal have to say about this pasuk is the truth, but even though it's the truth, it's not the pshat. Now, that's an example from last week's Torah reading. Here's a quick example from this week's Torah reading. I'll get it from the book, and that'll be a little easier. Did I click the right thing? Yeah, you should be able to see. This is a page out of the book. Let me make it a bit larger. I should be able. Oh, I can't. Why can't? Oh, because. Here we go. Here we go. Okay. Now, so it's the question of the Atzei Shittim. All right. In fact, I have a better idea. I think that, no, we'll do it this way. Okay. The beginning of this week's parasha, Bnei Yisrael are invited to bring truma, free will offerings to the Mishkan. And there's a shopping list, right? Zahav, Chesef, Nechoshet, Chelet, Argaman, Tolat, Shani, etc., etc. And somewhere down the list it says Atzei Shittim, a particular kind of wood. Right? The general English translation of it, as you can see reflected here, is acacia trees. Okay? So there's a question that Rashi addresses. Rashi asks, citing the Midrash Tanchuma, where did Bnei Yisrael get acacia trees in the wilderness? And the answer that he gives is alluded to here by Ibn Ezra in his own commentary, where he says, Yesh mekadmonenu, some of our predecessors have said that Yaakov Avinu planted these trees in Egypt, and at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, Moshe told the Jewish people, when you leave Egypt, be sure to take the Atzei Shittim with you. Right? And they even have a proof text. The proof text is that in the continuation, it says that anybody who had Atzei Shittim, B'chol asher nimtza ito Atzei Shittim heviu. Anybody who had Shittim trees donated them. So you scratch your head and say, what do you mean anybody who had Shittim trees with them? Who in the world would have Shittim trees with them? Why would anybody crossing the wilderness be carrying Shittim trees? I understand why they have gold and silver and precious stones and all sorts of, fancy clothing that they borrowed from their Egyptian neighbors. Because ostensibly, right, this is what they told the Egyptians, they're on their way to celebrate a festival to God. So they want to look their best. Why would they schlep Atzei Shittim? And Ibn Ezra continues in his commentary, and he's critical of it. And in his commentary, he formulates, you see in this sentence, he formulates a methodology. He says, V'hinei lo yada'anu, we're in a quandary. He says, Im Kabbalah hi biyad avotenu shemitzrayim hotziyom. If this idea that they took the Shittim trees out of Egypt is a Kabbalah means something that you received from the previous generation. Where did they get it from? Their predecessors. Which means that if you trace the chain of transmission all the way back to its origin, it had to have originated by somebody who was asked by somebody, where did the Shittim trees come from? And his answer was, what are you talking about? I carried them on my shoulder. So in essence, what Ibn Ezra calls a Kabbalah is essentially an historical fact. Ibn Ezra says you can't, now I'm getting political. Ibn Ezra says you can't deny historical facts. Okay? He says you can disagree in interpreting history. You can disagree in evaluating historical facts, but if something is an historical fact, you have to accept it as such. Therefore, says Ibn Ezra, as much as he disagrees with this interpretation, for reasons that he spelled out, okay, he says, if it's an historical fact, I take it at face value. However, he says, if it's only a savara, if it isn't an historical fact, but somebody came to his teacher one day and said, teach, I figured out where they got everything else for the Mishkan except the Atzei Shittim. Where did they get them from? And the teacher, not knowing the answer, meaning that it wasn't to the teacher's knowledge an historical fact, says, well, since I assumed that Shittim trees don't grow in the wilderness, they had to have taken them out of Egypt. So the student, being a good student, would say, why would they do that? Teacher would say, well, Moshe must have told them. Why would Moshe tell them to take out Shittim trees? Somebody must have told Moshe that they'll need Shittim trees. Who could have known that they'll need Shittim trees? Yaakov Avinu. So then says Ibn Ezra, if in fact that's pure speculation, then he says, Yesh levakesh derech acheret, we're entitled to seek an alternative approach. And his alternative approach is, adjacent to Har Sinai, there was a forest of Atzei Shittim. Now, basically, what we have here in this contrast between Rashi and Ibn Ezra, or the contrast between the Pshat and the Derash, is really a entree into what could be a philosophical difference of opinion, or for that matter, even a theological difference of opinion. Philosophically, it could be the question of how do we know something to be true? Do we know something to be true only if we can observe it ourselves empirically? Or can we presume something to be true if we have it on the authority of somebody we respect, whose integrity we respect? So Pshat would say, seeing is believing. Derash would say, sometimes hearing is believing. By the way, one of the ways in which throughout halakhic and Agadic literature, Jewish authors have referred to tradition is not always as masoret. They often refer to it as shemu'ah, by which they meant to indicate that this is something that we accept as true, not necessarily because we saw it with our own eyes, but because somebody whose authority we accept told it to us. It could also, on the other hand, perhaps even be perhaps a theological difference of opinion. How do we understand God? Is God something that everybody can understand entirely to their own satisfaction and exclusively through the use of their own cognitive faculties, which is what the Pashtan would say? Or somehow is a recognition or an understanding of God something that can be achieved only, or at least better, on a communal level, in which case I have to mix or temper my own original individual understanding with some elements that come to me through tradition. Wow, I see that we've really kind of reached our time limit. Smadar, if you've got some last question you want to ask or some point that you want to make on my behalf, I think that would be a nifty way in which to bring this to a...
Right, before we ask some questions. But I just want to use that last comment about the Ibn Ezra, who is such a Pashtan, but when there's a Midrash or when there's a halacha, right, that is Kabbalah, which means is Masorah from generation to generation, right? Ibn Ezra says, I accept it, because that is, even someone who's a Pashtan, right, is saying, when we have this Masorah and Kabbalah, that it's accepted from generation to generation, right, it's accepted. If it's a svara, if it's, oh, someone is doing it as a Perush, where they are, figuring something out. So then there is place, right, to, disagree. So I'm just going to ask with one last quick question before we get to questions from the crowd that Shalamis Hess is going to actually read out for us. And what is the role of the Tanakh educator today? Or why do you think there's such an interest? Or what should be our main focus as people who are pursuing Tanakh, interested in Talmud Torah on its vast scale, but also, specifically the interest in Tanakh?
So I think that partially the interest has been fanned, if you wish, by the return to the land of Israel. Certainly the Tanakh was written in the land of Israel, certainly canonized in the land of Israel, and the access both to the geography of the land of Israel, the topography of the land of Israel, the access through archaeology to remains of ancient Israel, the access through comparative Semitic languages and literatures to the thoughts and cultures of the people in whose midst the people of the Bible lived, is something that certainly has spurred renewed and increased interest in Tanakh. Not surprisingly, Rav Yoel Ben Nun, for example, recently put out a whole, like a 500-page book on Parashat Mishpatim. Now, of course, the majority of 500 pages are drawn from traditional sources, from the Mechilot Shmot, from the Talmud, from Parshanut, etc. But now and then there are comparisons between biblical civil law and the Code of Hammurabi. There are insights into biblical legal terms that are drawn from an understanding of either Akkadian, the ancient language of Mesopotamia, or Ugaritic, the language of ancient Canaan, so that scholars, modern traditional Bible scholars, are, as I said, taking advantage of, on the one hand, their increased familiarity with what the original author might have meant to be understood by his original audience, as well as continuing by their association with and familiarity with the tradition to bring it out of the past and into the present. And with that, I want to add an anecdote that I tell in the introduction to the book. I had the good fortune for many years to work with a professor who was, in his lifetime, the world's leading authority on Saadia Gaon. This professor, as a young man, studied in the well-known Beit Midrash L'Rabbanim in Vienna. And he told me an anecdote. He said that one day, all of the students in the Beit Midrash L'Rabbanim ganged up on the Rosh Yeshiva, who himself was a well-known scholar, in addition to being a Rosh Yeshiva. His name was Avraham or Adolf Schwartz. And they demanded that on the spot, he's got to name for them the best commentary on the Bible. And his answer without hesitation was Jewish history. I think that the educational goal of Tanakh is to get students to understand that Jewish history is the best commentary on Tanakh. That is to say, that the Tanakh is not ancient Jewish history. The Tanakh is maybe the earliest chapter in the ongoing history of the Jewish people. And as Ramban said it, and you can't say it any better, Ma'aseh Avot, Siman Levanim. I think that's a... Okay,
and Tanakh as the, Dvar Hashem that really animates everything that we do is so relevant in so many ways, and we access it through the Parshanim and the long Masorah, right, that we have. Okay.
If you will, people are fond of saying that tefillah is my opportunity to talk to God. I would add that Tanakh is you can hear his answer.
Right, Hashem speaking to us. Beautiful. Okay, we only have a very short time, but maybe one big or short question
Okay,
for Dr. Sokolow.
let's see what we,
Shalom, did you call something from the chat?
yeah, I'm going to pick something. Regarding Midrash, examples, Sifra, Sifri, some Midrashim are true and some are just allegorical. The Midrash doesn't directly tell you if it's true or not. Doesn't that matter? Don't we want to know if something is true or not? Please comment.
So I think I already addressed that by pointing out that true and false have to be distinguished from good and bad. By the way, not my innovation. That takes up a good part of the first part of the Moreh Nevuchim of Rambam, where Rambam wants to be sure that people understand the difference between emet and sheker and tov and ra. Right? The sky is blue is emet and sheker. But the fact that the sky is blue doesn't necessarily mean that that's good. So I would point out that Midrashim, if a Midrash makes a claim to an historical fact, then one can judge whether that Midrash is true or false. But if Midrash is giving an allegorical interpretation, then the categories of true and false really don't apply. I give one quick example. It's not an allegorical, maybe it is an allegorical, certainly a metaphorical example, if not an allegorical one, okay? What does the word yad mean when it appears in the Torah? The pshat, it means a hand, okay? Now, when Abraham's servant shows up in the home of Laban, so I'm back to my high school Bible contest days, right? When Eved Avraham appears in the house of Lavan, it says that he comes v'chol tuv adonav biyado. Now, what does that mean? That he has, literally it means that he has all of his master Avraham's wealth in his hand. What does that mean? Now, here it's funny. The Midrash says that he carried precious stones. So the value of the precious stones was the equivalent of kol tuv adonav, right? It was the equivalent of Abraham's wealth. So he was able basically to carry Abraham's wealth in his hand. Now, is that the way we would understand it, pshat? No. We would say the pshat means in his possession. Biyado doesn't literally have to mean it was in the palm of his hand. Biyado means that it was in his possession. And since he had 10 camels, right, then I'm assuming that the tuv was transported by the 10 camels. But here you have an interesting thing. So what is the Midrash? The Midrash here, right, is more literal, closer to the literal sense of the verse than what we would call the pshat. So sometimes pshat and drash seem to switch. They seem to reverse their positions. So as I said, whether you call an interpretation pshat or whether you call an interpretation drash, what matters most is that if we're dealing with matters of historical fact, call it true or false. If we're dealing with matters that aren't necessarily historical or factual, then talk about, I like this interpretation, I don't like it, I prefer this interpretation, or use terminology like that.
But I just want to thank Dr. Sokolow for an interesting discussion about, a wide-ranging set of ideas. So thank you so much. And again, I want to plug the book, right? Pursuing Peshat, Redifat HaPshat. And very interesting, both on an instructional level and also just educational and discussing some of the bigger questions.
And I thank you. If we went down the right path, it was because I followed you. And of course, I want to thank Shalamis also for organizing this. And once again, to thank all of you as well for being the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Sokolow. Thank you, Professor Rosensweig. This was fascinating, the most fascinating hour. And thank you all for coming.
Okay,
And
thank
definitely
you.
buy the book. Have a good night.
Good night.